When 56-year-old Elsie Parker stepped off the dusty platform in Cheyenne, Wyoming, she carried nothing but a worn carpetbag and a letter promising marriage to a widowed rancher. What she found instead was rejection, a man who took one look at her small frame and rode away, muttering about ordering a sturdy woman. Left abandoned in the red dust with nowhere to go, Elsie thought her dreams of a new life had crumbled like autumn leaves. But sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places. Watching from the shadows of the corral stood Ezekiel Boone, a towering, gentle giant whose own heart had grown weary from years of loneliness. When he saw her quiet dignity in the face of humiliation, something stirred in his weathered soul. What happened next would prove that the measure of love isn't found in size, but in the strength of one's character. But would Elsie trust this stranger enough to let him rebuild her shattered hopes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The journey to Wyoming territory had taken Elsie Parker 3 weeks and half her life savings. Now, standing alone on the weathered planks of the Cheyenne depot platform, she clutched her worn carpetbag and wondered if she'd made the greatest mistake of her 56 years. The carpetbag held everything that mattered: her mother's thimble, her finest needles, spools of thread in every shade imaginable, and the small leather pouch containing her grandmother's pearl buttons. These were the tools of her trade, the instruments that had kept her fed and housed in London's East End for 30 years. Until the factory machines came and made seamstresses like her obsolete, their nimble fingers no match for steam-powered efficiency. She'd been Elizabeth Parker then, proprietress of Parker's Fine Alterations on Whitechapel Road. Not wealthy, but respected. Women brought her their Sunday dresses and wedding gowns, trusting her steady hands to make them beautiful. But when the textile mills began producing ready-made clothing at prices no individual seamstress could match, her customers dwindled to a trickle, then disappeared entirely. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, carried by the same postman who'd delivered the final notices from her creditors. Mr. Harold Jameson of Wyoming Territory sought a wife, a sturdy woman of good character who could help him run his ranch and raise his 2 young sons. The advertisement had been placed through a respectable matrimonial agency, and his letter spoke of a comfortable life in God's country, where the air was clean and opportunities abundant for those willing to work hard. Elsie had read that letter a dozen times before responding. At 56, she'd never married, never even come close. There'd been a brief courtship with a bank clerk when she was 30, but he'd chosen a younger woman with better prospects. After that, she'd thrown herself into her work, convincing herself that independence was worth more than companionship. But now, with her shop closed and her savings nearly gone, independence felt like a cold comfort. The matrimonial agency had assured her that Mr. Jameson was a God-fearing man of good reputation, recently widowed and in need of a helpmate. The train ticket he'd sent was proof of his serious intentions. Standing in the harsh Wyoming sun, Elsie remembered how those intentions had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. Harold Jameson had been waiting at the platform, just as promised. A man of medium height, with prematurely grey hair and hands that spoke of honest labor. When she'd stepped down from the train car, carpetbag in hand, he'd looked her up and down with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. "You're smaller than I expected," he'd said, his voice carrying disappointment like a weight. "I specifically requested a sturdy woman, someone who could handle ranch work, help with the cattle." Elsie had tried to explain that size wasn't everything, that her hands were strong from years of needlework, her back straight from hours spent over a sewing table. But Harold Jameson had already made up his mind. "I'm sorry, miss, but this won't do. I need someone who can pull her weight, not someone I'll have to worry about getting trampled by a bull." He tipped his hat with perfunctory politeness. "I'll arrange for your return passage. Good day." And just like that, her dreams of a new life had evaporated like morning mist. That had been yesterday. She'd spent the night on a bench in the depot waiting room, using her carpetbag as a pillow, listening to the lonely whistle of distant trains. The station master had been kind enough to bring her coffee and biscuits this morning, but she couldn't impose on his charity much longer. Cheyenne was a rough town in 1885, all dust and ambition and the smell of cattle. Buildings seemed to sprout from the prairie like weed-chastely constructed affairs of raw lumber and hope. The main street bustled with cowboys, merchants, and railroad workers, all of them moving with the determined pace of people who had places to be and fortunes to make. Elsie felt like a leaf caught in their wake. She'd counted her remaining money 3 times, enough for a train ticket back to New York, but not enough to start over again. London was an ocean away, and even if she could afford passage, what waited for her there? Her old room had been rented to someone else, her shop sold to pay debts. She was, in every sense that mattered, homeless. The sun climbed higher, and Elsie sought shade beneath the depot's overhang. From there, she could see the corrals where cattle lowed and stamped, raising clouds of red dust that painted everything the color of dried blood. Cowboys moved among the animals with easy confidence, their voices carrying instructions and jokes across the yards. One man stood apart from the others, and Elsie found her attention drawn to him despite her troubles. He was impossibly tall, she guessed, 6.5 feet, at least with shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of the world. His hair was silver grey beneath a battered hat, and his face, though weathered by sun and wind, held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing frame. He moved among the cattle with practiced ease, his voice low and soothing as he guided them through the gates. There was something almost reverent in the way he worked, as if he understood that these animals were more than just commodities, they were living beings, deserving of respect. Elsie watched him for the better part of an hour, drawn by his quiet competence. When he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, their eyes met across the dusty expanse. For a moment, neither looked away. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of polite acknowledgement before returning to his work. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the station master's biscuits that morning. The small cafe across from the depot beckoned, but Elsie was reluctant to spend money on food when every penny counted toward her uncertain future. As the afternoon wore on, the platform emptied of passengers. The eastbound train wouldn't arrive until tomorrow, and Elsie resigned herself to another night on the depot bench. She'd slept in worse places during her lean years in London. The tall cowboy finished his work as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Instead of heading to the saloon with his companions, he walked toward the depot. Toward her. Elsie's heart hammered as he approached. Up close, he was even more imposing, but his ice-pale blue like winter sky held no threat. If anything, they seemed sad, as if they'd seen too much sorrow for one lifetime. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim again. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel in a riverbed. "I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting here since yesterday. Is everything all right?" The question, asked with such genuine concern, nearly undid her. Elsie felt tears prick her eyes but forced them back. She'd learned long ago that crying solved nothing. "I'm quite well, thank you," she lied, lifting her chin with what dignity she could muster. "Just waiting for the eastbound train." He studied her face with those pale eyes, and Elsie had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see straight through her careful composure to the fear and uncertainty beneath. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but you look like someone who's had a run of bad luck. I'm Ezekiel Boone, folks call me Zeke. I've been working cattle in these parts for more years than I care to count." "Elsie Parker," she replied, then added with a bitter laugh, "formerly of London, England, and more recently, a mail-order bride who didn't quite meet specifications." Something flickered in Zeke's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or sympathy. "Harold Jameson?" Elsie nodded, surprised by his immediate comprehension. "I figured as much. Saw you talking to him yesterday, saw how it ended." Zeke's jaw tightened. "Harold's not a bad man, but he's got some particular ideas about what makes a good wife. Ideas that don't take into account what really matters." "And what really matters, Mr. Boone?" "Character," he said without hesitation. "Kindness, the strength to weather life's storms without losing your goodness. Size has nothing to do with any of that. The simplicity of his words, spoken with such conviction, made Elsie's throat tight with emotion. When had anyone ever spoken to her with such respect, such understanding? "That's very kind of you to say, but I'm afraid Mr. Jameson's opinion is the one that matters. I'll be returning to New York tomorrow." "To what?" The question caught her off guard. "I beg your pardon? What are you returning to? Family, work, a place that feels like home?" Elsie opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Because the truth was, she had nothing to return to. No family, no work, no home. Just the vague hope that somehow, somewhere, she might find a way to start over. Zeke seemed to read her silence. "I've got a proposition for you, Miss Parker. There's an old line shack about 3 miles north of here, right on the edge of Antelope Creek. Built it myself years back when I was working for the cattle company. It's not much, one room, stone fireplace, good roof, but it's sound and dry. You're welcome to stay there while you figure out your next move." Elsie stared at him. "I couldn't possibly accept such generosity from a stranger." "Why not? Seems to me you could use a safe place to rest and think, and I could use the peace of mind, knowing you're not sleeping on train station benches." "But what would people think? A woman alone, accepting shelter from a man she's just met?" Zeke's smile was gentle. "People will think what they want to think, Miss Parker. The question is, what do you think? Do you trust me not to harm you?" Elsie looked into his weathered face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. What she found instead was sincerity, so profound it took her breath away. This man, this gentle giant who could have easily intimidated or overpowered her, was offering her exactly what she needed most, a chance to catch her breath and find her footing. "Yes," she said quietly. "I believe I do trust you, Mr. Boone." "Good. Then let's get you settled before dark. I've got a wagon we can use for your things." As Zeke headed toward the livery stable, Elsie remained on the platform, carpetbag at her feet, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of 5 minutes, her entire situation had changed. She was no longer stranded and homeless. She had shelter, offered by a man whose very presence seemed to calm the storm of anxiety that had been raging in her chest since Harold Jameson's rejection. Looking toward the western horizon, where the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Elsie Parker felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not the desperate hope of a cornered animal, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who had been offered a second chance. Perhaps Wyoming territory might be the beginning of something new after all. The abandoned line shack sat like a forgotten prayer on the banks of Antelope Creek, its weathered logs silver-gray in the fading light. Zeke's wagon creaked to a stop beside the small structure, and Elsie found herself staring at what would be her home for the foreseeable future. It wasn't much to look at: a single room, maybe 12 feet square, with a stone chimney that had seen better days and windows, so small they seemed like afterthoughts. But the roof appeared sound, and the door hung straight on its hinges. After a night on the depot bench, it looked like a palace. "Built this place in '78, Zeke said, climbing down from the wagon with surprising grace for such a large man. Company was running cattle through this valley, needed shelter for the line riders who watched the herds. Spent 3 weeks getting the logs just right, chinking every gap to keep the wind out." He opened the door with a key he produced from his vest pocket, and the hinges groaned in protest. Inside, dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. The space was sparse, but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough wooden table sat beneath the front window, and a simple bed frame occupied the far corner. "It's perfect," Elsie said, and meant it. After the uncertainty of the past 24 hours, the little cabin felt like sanctuary. Zeke seemed surprised by her reaction. "It's been empty for 3 years. Needs a good cleaning, fresh bedding, provisions. I can ride into town tomorrow, get what you need." "Mr. Boone," Elsie set down her carpetbag and turned to face him. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me, you owe me nothing. Yet you're offering me shelter, Supplies, kindness, I've done nothing to earn. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through his silver hair, and for a moment, Elsie glimpsed something raw in his expression, a loneliness so profound it took her breath away. "I know what it's like to be alone in the world," he said finally, "to have nowhere to turn, no one who cares if you live or die. I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone, especially not a lady who's been dealt unfair treatment. But surely you have family, friends?" "No, ma'am. Lost my folks to fever when I was 16. Been on my own ever since. Thought about marriage a time or two. But the kind of life I've led always moving, following the herd sits not suited to family." He gestured toward the cabin. "This place has been empty too long. Seems right that someone should make use of it." Elsie studied his face in the gathering twilight. There was more to his story, she sensed, deeper waters beneath his simple explanation. But she also recognized the look of someone who'd built walls around painful memories, and she wouldn't presume to tear them down on such short acquaintance. "Well then, I accept your generous offer with gratitude," she said, "though I insist on paying rent once I find employment." "No need for that. Just seeing the place lived in again will be payment enough." Zeke unloaded her carpetbag and a few supplies he'd brought from town: coffee, beans, salt pork, and a loaf of bread that smelled like heaven to Elsie's empty stomach. He also produced a bundle of firewood and set about building a fire in the stone fireplace. "Nights get cold out here, even in summer," he explained as flames began to lick at the kindling. "This fireplace draws well, designed it myself, should keep you warm and dry." As the fire caught and filled the small space with dancing light, Elsie felt something she hadn't experienced in months: a sense of belonging. The cabin wasn't hers, would never be hers, but for now it offered what she needed most: safety and solitude. "I should head back to town," Zeke said, settling his hat back on his head. "Got work in the morning, but I'll check on you tomorrow evening, make sure you have everything you need." "That's very kind, but I don't want to be a burden. Miss Parker." His voice was gentle but firm. "Helping you isn't a burden. It's a privilege." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning Elsie wasn't quite ready to examine. She walked him to the door, and he paused on the threshold. "There's a rifle above the fireplace, loaded and ready. Probably won't need it. Nothing dangerous in these parts except the occasional coyote, but it's there if you need peace of mind." "Thank you for everything." Zeke touched his hat brim in that gesture she was already beginning to recognize. "Good night, Miss Parker. Sleep well." She watched his wagon disappear into the darkness, its wheels creaking a lonely rhythm. Only then did she close the door and turn to survey her temporary home. The fire cast warm shadows on the log walls, making the small space feel intimate rather than cramped. Elsie opened her carpetbag and began arranging her few possessions on the rough table: her sewing supplies, her mother's Bible, the small tin daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. The simple act of unpacking, of claiming even this temporary space as her own, felt like the first step toward building a new life. She'd lost everything in London: her shop, her reputation, her sense of purpose. Harold Jameson's rejection had been the final blow, proof that even her last desperate gamble had failed. But perhaps failure wasn't the end of her story. Perhaps it was simply a comma, a pause before the next chapter began. She made coffee with water from the creek and ate bread and salt pork by firelight, savoring the first real meal she'd had in days. Outside, night sounds began to emerge: the splash of water over stones, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through cottonwood leaves. London had never been quiet. Even in the deepest night, there were always sound scarrages on cobblestones, voices from the public houses, the endless rumble of commerce. This silence was different, profound and healing. For the first time since leaving England, Elsie felt her shoulders relax. She prepared for bed by the firelight, washing her face with creek water, heated in a tin pot Zeke had provided. The bed frame held a straw mattress that smelled of dust and time, but it was infinitely more comfortable than the depot bench. As she lay listening to the fire crackle and settle, Elsie's thoughts turned to the man who'd rescued her from desperation. Ezekiel Boone was unlike any man she'd ever met. Gentle, despite his size, generous without expectation of reward, lonely in a way that resonated with her own solitude. There had been something in his eyes when he'd spoken of being alone in the world. A pain so carefully contained it had made her chest tight with sympathy. What had shaped him into this careful, kind man who offered shelter to strangers? What had taught him to recognize loneliness in others? Sleep came slowly, bringing dreams of silver-gray logs and pale blue eyes, of strong hands building sanctuary from nothing but timber and compassion. And for the first time in months, Elsie Parker slept without fear, protected by walls that a gentle giant had raised with his own hands years before, never knowing they would one day shelter a heart as wounded and hopeful as his own. The abandoned line shack had become something more than shelter. It had become the first step toward a future neither she nor Zeke could yet imagine, built on a foundation of unexpected kindness and the possibility that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as endings. Elsie woke to sunlight streaming through the small windows and the sound of water tumbling over creek stones. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was then. Memory returned with the scent of wood smoke and the sight of rough log walls. The abandoned line shack, her temporary sanctuary. She rose and stepped outside to find the morning crisp and clear, the Wyoming sky so vast it made her feel dizzy after years of London's narrow streets and sooty buildings. Antelope Creek ran swift and clean beside the cabin, its banks lined with cottonwoods whose leaves whispered secrets in the morning breeze. The practical needs of daily life demanded attention. She needed fresh water, food, and a way to keep herself occupied while she decided what to do next. The creek solved the water problem, but provisions were another matter entirely. She was heating water for coffee when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the window, she saw Zeke riding toward the cabin on a sturdy bay horse, a pack mule trailing behind, loaded with supplies. "Morning, Miss Parker," he called as he dismounted. "Brought you some necessities from town." Elsie stepped outside, smoothing her skirts self-consciously. She'd slept in her traveling dress, having no nightgown in her small bag, and felt disheveled, despite her attempts to tidy herself. "Mr. Boone, you're too generous. I can't keep accepting charity." "Not charity," he interrupted gently. "Neighborliness. And please call me Zeke. Mr. Boone makes me feel old." He began unloading the pack mule with efficient movements, and Elsie saw he'd brought enough supplies to last a week: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and even a small jar of honey that made her mouth water. "There's also this," he said, producing a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might have use for it." Elsie unwrapped the package to find a simple but well-made dress in deep blue cotton, along with a chemise and stockings. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. "Zeke, I cannot accept clothing from you. It wouldn't be proper." "Mrs. Henderson at the general store picked it out," he said quickly. "Told her about your situation. Said you might need a change of clothes. She's a good woman, understands how hard it can be for a lady traveling alone." The kindness of it, that he'd thought of her comfort and modesty, that he'd enlisted another woman's help to preserve her dignity, brought tears to Elsie's eyes. When had anyone shown her such consideration? "Thank you," she whispered. "You've been more than kind." They carried the supplies inside together, and Elsie noticed how Zeke had to duck his head to clear the doorframe. The cabin seemed even smaller with him in it, his presence both protective and unsettling in ways she couldn't quite define. "I was wondering," he said as they arranged items on the rough shelves, "if you might be interested in some work. Nothing permanent, mind you, just something to keep your hands busy." Elsie looked up from the bag of flour she was storing. "What kind of work?" Zeke pulled something from his saddlebager shirt with a torn seam and missing buttons. "I'm not much with a needle, and my clothes show it. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you're a seamstress by trade. Wondered if you might consider doing some mending for me. I'd pay fair wages, of course." The offer was like water to a woman dying of thirst. Elsie took the shirt and examined the damage with practiced eyes. Simple repairs, nothing she couldn't manage easily. "I'd be happy to help," she said, "though I should warn you, I have very particular standards. When I finish with this shirt, it will look better than when you bought it." Zeke's smile transformed his weathered face. "I was hoping you'd say that." They spent the morning in easy conversation as Elsie worked on his shirt. She learned that he'd been in Wyoming territory for 8 years, that he preferred working with cattle to people, and that he'd built this cabin during the hardest winter he'd ever endured. "Spent Christmas here alone," he said, watching her nimble fingers guide the needle. "Storm lasted 3 days, snow piled halfway up the windows, but this little place kept me warm and dry." "It must have been lonely," Elsie observed, thinking of her own solitary Christmases in London. "Was at first. But loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing, I learned. Solitude can be peaceful when it's chosen." Elsie understood exactly what he meant. She'd found peace in her sewing room, in the quiet concentration of creating something beautiful with her hands. But the loneliness that came with having no one to share her life with, that was different, sharper, harder to bear. As she worked, Zeke whittled a piece of wood with a small knife, his large hands surprisingly graceful as he shaped what appeared to be a spoon. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the creek's murmur and the occasional snap of the fire. "You're making that for me," Elsie said, recognizing the truth in his careful attention to the spoon's proportions. Zeke's hands stilled. "Noticed you only had one, and it's seen better days. Thought you might appreciate something new." The simple gift touched her more than grand gestures ever could. Here was a man who noticed details, who saw needs and quietly filled them without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. "It's beautiful work," she said, admiring the smooth curves he was coaxing from the raw wood. "You have artistic hands." "Just practical ones. Learned young that if you need something and can't buy it, you'd better know how to make it." By midday, Elsie had finished repairing his shirt and replaced the missing buttons with ones from her precious collection. When she held it up for his inspection, Zeke's eyes widened. "Miss Parker, this looks brand new. Better than new, actually." "Quality materials last when they're properly cared for," she said, pleased by his reaction. "This is good cloth, well made. It just needed attention." Zeke paid her for the work more than the repair was worth, she protested, but he insisted it was fair compensation for skilled labor. The coins felt warm in her palm, the first money she'd earned since losing her shop. "I should head back to town," he said reluctantly, "but I'll be by tomorrow if that's agreeable. Got more shirts that could use your attention." After he left, Elsie changed into the blue dress Mrs. Henderson had selected. It fit perfectly, the color bringing out her eyes and complementing her silver-streaked brown hair. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again, not a desperate woman grasping at straws, but a skilled artisan with value to offer. She spent the afternoon exploring the immediate area around the cabin, familiarizing herself with her temporary home. The creek provided fresh water and a place to wash clothes. Wild berries grew along the banks, and she spotted herbs she recognized from her mother's garden in England. As evening approached, she found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats, hoping Zeke might return. When he didn't, she felt a stab of disappointment that surprised her with its intensity. She prepared a simple supper and ate by the fire, the hand-carved spoon smooth and warm against her lips. Outside, coyotes began their evening song, wild and haunting. Instead of frightening her, the sound felt like a welcome to this vast, beautiful country that was slowly becoming less foreign and more like home. Before bed, she examined the other shirts Zeke had mentioned, needing repair. Each one told a story, a tear from barbed wire, buttons lost to hard use, seams strained by the demands of physical labor. As she planned the repairs needed, Elsie felt a deep satisfaction. This was work she understood, work that mattered. For the first time since leaving London, she had purpose again. It might be temporary, this arrangement with a kind stranger, but it was real. And sometimes, she reflected as she banked the fire for the night, real was enough to build hope upon. 3 days had passed since Zeke's last visit, and Elsie found herself watching the horizon more often than she cared to admit. She'd finished mending 2 more of his shirts and had begun work on a third, but her hands moved automatically while her mind wandered to conversations they'd shared and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. The solitude she'd initially welcomed was beginning to feel less peaceful and more lonely. She'd grown accustomed to his daily visits, to the sound of his voice and the comfort of his presence. Now, with only the creek and the wind for company, the cabin felt too quiet. She was hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between 2 cottonwoods when she heard familiar hoofbeats. Her heart lifted as Zeke rode into view, but something was different about him today. His shoulders were set with tension, and his usual easy smile was nowhere to be seen. "Afternoon, Miss Parker," he said, dismounting with less than his usual grace. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. I was just finishing the washing." She gestured toward the shirts drying in the breeze. "Your mending is ready, and I've made fresh coffee if you'd like some." "That sounds welcome," he said, and Elsie noticed he didn't quite meet her eyes. They settled at the rough table with steaming cups, but the comfortable silence that usually characterized their time together felt strained. Zeke stared into his coffee, as if seeking answers in its dark depths. "Is something troubling you?" Elsie asked gently. Zeke's jaw tightened. "Had a visitor today, Mrs. Abernathy from the Church Ladies' Auxiliary. Seems word has gotten around about your situation." Elsie's stomach clenched. "What did she say?" "Nothing pleasant. Seems some folks think it's improper for an unmarried woman to be living out here alone, accepting help from an unmarried man. They're concerned about appearances." "I see." Elsie set down her cup with careful precision. "And what do you think about appearances, Zeke?" Finally, he looked at her, and she saw anger simmering in his pale eyes. "I think Mrs. Abernathy and her friends would rather see you sleeping in the street than risk a whisper of scandal. I think they're more concerned with gossip than Christian charity." "But their concerns aren't entirely without merit," Elsie said quietly. "I am a woman alone, accepting shelter from a man I've known less than a week, in proper society." "Proper society," Zeke interrupted, "would have left you stranded at that train depot with nowhere to go. Proper society would have let you starve rather than risk a raised eyebrow." The vehemence in his voice surprised her. "You're angry." "Damn right, I'm angry." He caught himself and colored. "Begging your pardon for the language, but yes, I'm angry. These same women who are so concerned about propriety, where were they when you needed help? Where was their Christian charity when you were sleeping on depot benches?" Elsie felt warmth spread through her chest at his fierce defense, but she also recognized the reality of their situation. "What did you tell Mrs. Abernathy?" "That your living arrangements were temporary and none of her concern. But I know how these things go. Word will spread, and soon the whole county will be talking." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of social expectations settling between them like an unwelcome guest. Elsie had faced judgment before. An unmarried woman in business for herself had attracted plenty of raised eyebrows in London. But this felt different, more personal somehow. "I should leave," she said finally. "Find somewhere else to stay until I can book passage back east." "No." The word came out sharper than Zeke intended, and he softened his tone. "I mean, you don't have to leave on account of busybodies with nothing better to do than spread gossip. This is your home for as long as you need it. But if it's causing problems for you, let me worry about that." Zeke reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch sent warmth shooting up her arm. "You've done nothing wrong, Elsie. Nothing to be ashamed of." The use of her first name felt intimate, a crossing of invisible boundaries that made her pulse quicken. She looked down at their joined handshees so large and weathered, hers small and paly, and felt something shift between them. "Tell me about your family," she said, needing to change the subject before her thoughts wandered into dangerous territory. Zeke's hand stilled on hers. "Not much to tell. Lost my parents young, like I mentioned. No brothers or sisters. But there must have been someone, a woman perhaps. You're a good man, Zeke. I find it hard to believe you've been alone all these years by choice." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he pulled his hand away and stood, walking to the window that overlooked the creek. There was someone once, long time ago now. His voice was carefully neutral. Her name was Sarah. We met in Colorado, planned to marry. Elsie waited, sensing there was more to the story. She died of cholera the winter before our wedding. Whole town was hit hard that year, lost a lot of good people. He turned back to face her, and Elsie saw old pain carefully contained. After that, I kept moving, easier not to get attached, when you know how quickly everything can be taken away. The simple words carried a weight of grief that made Elsie's throat tight. She understood now why he'd recognized her loneliness so quickly, why he'd been moved to help a stranger. He knew what it felt like to lose everything, to be left with nothing but the choice to keep going or give up entirely. "I'm sorry," she said. "That must have been devastating." "Was a long time ago," Zeke said, but Elsie heard the hollowness in his voice. Some wounds, she knew, never fully healed, they just scarred over enough to let you function. "I never came close to marriage," she offered. "There was a gentleman caller when I was younger, but he chose someone with better prospects. After that, I threw myself into my work, convinced myself I didn't need anyone. And now?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Elsie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Now I'm not sure what I believe anymore. This place, this situation, it's shown me that perhaps I was wrong about a great many things." Zeke returned to the table, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he pulled something wrapped in oiled cloth from his jacket pocket. "Brought you something," he said, setting the bundle before her. "Found it in my things, thought you might appreciate it." Elsie unwrapped the cloth to reveal a patchwork quilt, old but lovingly made. The fabrics were faded with age, but the stitching was still strong, the pattern wedding ring still clear. "It was my mother's," Zeke said quietly. "Made it for her hope chest before she married my father. Been carrying it around for years, never had anywhere proper to use it." Elsie ran her fingers over the delicate stitchwork, recognizing the hours of labor that had gone into creating something so beautiful. Several patches were coming loose, and there were spots where the fabric had worn thin. "It needs mending," she said. "Most worthwhile things do, eventually." Their eyes met, and Elsie felt that shift again, that sense of standing on the edge of something that would change everything. The quilt wasn't just a gift, it was a gesture of trust, a sharing of something precious and personal. "I'll take good care of it," she promised. "I know you will." As the afternoon wore on, they talked about safer subjects, the weather, Zeke's work with the cattle, Elsie's observations about the local wildlife. But underneath the ordinary conversation, something deeper was building, a connection that had nothing to do with convenience or charity, and everything to do with two lonely souls, recognizing something precious in each other. When Zeke finally rose to leave, the sun was painting the western sky in shades of rose and gold. "I'll be by tomorrow," he said, settling his hat on his head. "Maybe we can work on that quilt together. I'm no seamstress, but I can hold fabric steady." After he left, Elsie spread the quilt on her bed, studying the damage by lamplight. It would take weeks to properly restore, but she looked forward to the work. Each stitch would be a meditation, a connection to the woman who'd created this beautiful thing with hope for the future. As she prepared for bed, she found herself humming something she hadn't done since losing her shop. The melody was an old one her mother had sung while working, a tune that spoke of contentment and purpose. Outside, the night sounds of Wyoming territory serenaded her towards sleep, and for the first time in years, Elsie Parker fell asleep, not just unafraid, but genuinely happy. The morning brought unexpected visitors. Elsie was tending the small garden she'd started behind the cabin when she heard the creak of wagon wheels and voices carried on the wind. Through the cottonwoods, she glimpsed a buckboard approaching with two figures on the seat. Her heart sank as she recognized Mrs. Abernathy's stern profile and the black dress that seemed to announce her moral authority to anyone within a mile radius. Beside her sat a younger woman Elsie didn't recognize, equally severe in expression and attire. Elsie smoothed her skirts and walked around to the front of the cabin, positioning herself in the dooryard with what dignity she could muster. The women climbed down from their wagon with the air of officials conducting important business. "Miss Parker," Mrs. Abernathy announced without preamble. "I am Margaret Abernathy, president of the Cheyenne Ladies Auxiliary. This is Mrs. Prudence Walsh, our secretary. We've come to discuss your situation." "Good morning, ladies," Elsie replied with careful politeness. "Would you care for coffee? I've just put on a fresh pot." "This isn't a social call," Mrs. Walsh interjected, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We're here on a matter of moral concern to the entire community." Elsie felt her temper begin to simmer, but kept her voice level. "I see. And what moral concern might that be?" Mrs. Abernathy drew herself up to her full height, which was considerable. "The improper arrangement you've entered into with Mr. Boone. An unmarried woman living alone, accepting gifts and shelter from an unmarried man, it's simply not done in respectable society." "I wasn't aware that accepting shelter when homeless was considered improper," Elsie said. "In my understanding, Christian charity encourages helping those in need." "Don't quote scripture to us, young woman," Mrs. Walsh snapped. "We know our Christian duty, but there are proper ways to help the unfortunate, and this isn't one of them." "Young woman." Elsie almost laughed at the description. At 56, she was likely older than both of these moral arbiters combined. "What would you suggest as a proper alternative?" she asked. "The county has a poorhouse," Mrs. Abernathy said. "Clean, supervised, appropriate for a woman in your circumstances." Elsie had seen poorhouses in London grim institutions where hope went to die slowly. The thought of ending her days in such a place made her stomach turn. "That's very kind, but I'm neither poor nor in need of supervision. I have work." "Mending clothes for the man who's housing you," Mrs. Walsh interrupted. "That's hardly respectable employment. It's honest work that harms no one." "It's the appearance of impropriety that concerns us," Mrs. Abernathy said. "Surely you understand that a woman of breeding must be above suspicion." The assumption that she was a woman of breeding, despite her obvious circumstances, struck Elsie as both patronizing and hypocritical. These women hadn't cared about her breeding when she was sleeping on depot benches. "I appreciate your concern," Elsie said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But my living arrangements are temporary and entirely proper. Mr. Boone has shown me nothing but kindness and respect." "For now," Mrs. Walsh said darkly. "But men's natures are well known. It's only a matter of time before he expects compensation for his generosity." The insinuation made Elsie's cheeks burn with anger. "Mr. Boone is a gentleman in every sense of the word. How dare you suggest otherwise? We're not here to debate Mr. Boone's character." "Mrs. Abernathy said, "We're here to offer you a solution that preserves everyone's reputation. The Ladies' Auxiliary is prepared to arrange transportation back to wherever you came from. And if I choose not to accept your generous offer..." The two women exchanged meaningful looks. "Then we'll be forced to take the matter up with the sheriff," Mrs. Walsh said. "There are laws about vagrancy and moral turpitude." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly banked fire. Elsie realized she was trapped between their version of propriety and the poorhouse, with legal consequences lurking if she chose neither. "I'll need time to consider your offer," she said finally. 3 days, Mrs. Abernathy announced. "That should be sufficient to arrange your affairs." They climbed back into their wagon and drove away, leaving Elsie standing in the dust of their moral certainty. Her hands shook as she went back inside the cabin, their words echoing in her mind. She was still sitting at the table, staring into cold coffee, when Zeke arrived that afternoon. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "What's happened?" he asked, settling his large frame into the chair across from her. Elsie told him about the morning's visitors, watching his expression grow darker with each word. By the time she finished, his jaw was set in a line she'd never seen before. "Moral turpitude," he said, the words dripping with disgust. "As if showing kindness to someone in need is a crime." "They're not entirely wrong about appearances," Elsie said wearily. "An unmarried woman living alone with an unmarried man support it does look improper." only to people determined to see impropriety where none exists. Zeke stood and began pacing the small confines of the cabin. What did you tell them? That I'd consider their offer. What else could I say? They threatened legal action if I don't comply. Zeke stopped pacing and turned to face her. There's another solution. The poorhouse? I'd rather take my chances back east. Not the poorhouse. Marriage. The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the careful friendship they'd built. Elsie stared at him, certain she'd misheard. I beg your pardon. Marriage, Zeke repeated, and she realized he was serious. If we were married, there'd be no question of impropriety. You could stay in Wyoming, keep your home here. Zeke, you can't be serious. We barely know each other. I know you're kind and brave and stronger than you realize. I know you've been dealt unfair treatment and deserve better. I know I feel more at peace when you're near than I have in 20 years. His words made her heart race, but she forced herself to think rationally. You're talking about a marriage of convenience to satisfy gossips. That's not fair to either of us. Would it be so terrible? We get along well. We enjoy each other's company. I can provide for you, protect you. Isn't that more than many marriages start with? Elsie looked around the small cabin that had become home, thought about the life she'd been building here, the work that gave her purpose, the peace she'd found by the creek, the growing warmth she felt for the gentle giant who'd rescued her from despair. What about love? She asked quietly. Zeke's expression softened. What about it? We're not children, Elsie. We both know love can grow from friendship and mutual respect. Hell, we might already be halfway there. The admission hung between them, fraught with possibility and risk. Elsie felt something flutter in her chest knot, the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper and more enduring. You'd really want to marry me? A woman past her prime, with nothing to offer but needle skills and a tarnished reputation. Zeke crossed to where she sat and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his large, calloused ones. I'd consider myself the luckiest man in Wyoming territory to have you as my wife, he said solemnly. You're not past anything, Elsie Parker. You're exactly what I never knew I was looking for. Looking into his pale blue eyes, Elsie saw sincerity so profound it took her breath away. This wasn't a man driven by desperation or convenience. It was someone who genuinely cared for her well-being, who saw value in her that others had missed. I need time to think, she whispered. Of course, but don't take too long. Those vultures gave you 3 days, and I'd rather not give them the satisfaction of running you out of town. After he left, Elsie walked down to the creek and sat on a fallen log, watching the water flow over smooth stones. Marriage to Zeke would solve her immediate problems, but it would also complicate everything. Could she enter into such an arrangement, knowing her feelings for him were already deeper than friendship? Was it fair to marry a man who might never love her as more than a convenient companion? But as the sun set and painted the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Elsie found herself imagining a future here not as a temporary guest, but as a permanent resident. Not as a woman alone, but as half of a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. For the first time in days, the knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. Perhaps some risks were worth taking after all. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, matching Elsie's unsettled mood. She'd spent a restless night wrestling with Zeke's proposal, her practical mind warring with her cautious heart. By the time pale light filtered through the cabin windows, she'd reached no firm conclusion. She was brewing coffee when she heard the distinctive ring of hammer on metal coming from somewhere upstream. Following the sound, she discovered Zeke at a makeshift forge he'd set up near the creek bend, heating iron over a bed of coals and shaping it with practiced blows. "Morning," he called when he spotted her, pausing in his work to wipe sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "Hope I didn't wake you." "What are you making?" she asked, fascinated by the sight of him working the metal with such skill. Zeke held up what appeared to be a long, thin nail, perfectly formed and sharp. "Hand-forged nails. Need about 200 of them." "Whatever for?" He set down his hammer and fixed her with that steady gaze that always seemed to see straight through to her soul. "For your cabin." Elsie's breath caught. "My cabin? Been thinking about what you said yesterday, about needing time to consider things. Occurred to me that maybe what you need isn't time to think about marriage. Maybe what you need is a proper home of your own, free and clear, where nobody can tell you what's proper or improper." He gestured upstream toward a gentle rise overlooking the creek. "That spot there has good drainage, southern exposure for light and warmth, close enough to water but high enough to avoid floods. Been surveying it in my mind for weeks now." Elsie followed his gaze and saw wooden stakes driven into the ground in a neat rectangle, marking what would be the foundation of a house. Her heart began to pound. "Zeke, you can't possibly mean to build me a house. The expense alone. Timber's free for the cutting, and I know where to find good stone for the foundation. Labor's free too, seeing as I'd be doing the work myself." He picked up another piece of iron and thrust it into the coals. "These nails are the only real expense, and iron's cheap enough. But the time involved, the effort. I've got time. Been working cattle for other men long enough saved my wages. Got enough put by to take a season for myself." He pulled the heated iron from the fire and began shaping it with careful blows. "Besides, I like building things, always have." Elsie watched him work, mesmerized by the rhythm of hammer on metal and the way his powerful shoulders moved beneath his shirt. Each nail he forged was perfect straight, strong, made to last. Like everything else he did, the work was done with care and attention to detail. "You've really thought this through," she said. "Been thinking about it since the day I found you on that depot platform. Figured if you decided to stay in Wyoming, you'd need a proper place to live. And if you decided to leave," he shrugged, "well, the territory can always use another good house." The casual way he spoke of her possible departure made Elsie's chest tight. "You'd build me a house even if I might not stay to live in it?" Zeke's hammer paused mid-swing. "I'd build you a house because you deserve one. What you do with it after that is your choice to make." The simple generosity of the gesture left her speechless. This man was willing to spend months of his life and his own resources to give her something she'd never thought to want a home built specifically for her, to her needs and preferences. "Where would I live while you're building it?" she asked, surprised to find herself seriously considering the proposal. "Right where you are. Line shack's perfectly comfortable for the time it'll take. Figure I can have the walls up and roofed before the first snow. Finish the interior work over the winter." "And what about Mrs. Abernathy and her moral concerns?" "Let her complain. By the time she works up enough righteous indignation to cause real trouble, you'll have a house with your name on the deed and the legal right to live wherever you damn well please." The idea was audacious, impractical, and absolutely perfect. Elsie found herself grinning for the first time in days. "You're completely mad, you know that?" Zeke's answering smile was radiant. "Been called worse things. Is that a yes?" "It's a yes to the house," Elsie said carefully. "As for the other matter, one thing at a time," Zeke said gently. "Let me build you a home first, then we can see what else might need building." They spent the morning discussing plans for the house. Zeke had sketched rough drawings on pieces of bark, showing a simple but well-designed structure with a main room, separate bedroom, and even a small space that could serve as a proper sewing room. 2 windows in the sewing room, he explained, positioned to catch the best light. "And I was thinking we could build in some shelves and cubby holes for your supplies." The attention to her specific needs touched Elsie deeply. This wasn't just a generic house, it was being designed around her life, her work, her preferences. "It's perfect," she said, studying the sketches, "but you must let me help with the construction. House building's heavy work. I have 2 good hands and a strong back, and I imagine there are parts of the job that don't require brute strength." Zeke considered this. "Could use help with the chinking and someone to hold boards steady while I nail them. Long as you promise not to get in the way when I'm handling the heavy timbers." Agreed. They shook hands on the arrangement, and Elsie felt the calluses on his palm from years of honest labor. This was a man who knew how to work, who took pride in creating things that would last. The rain stopped around midday, and they walked up to the building site to pace off the dimensions. Standing in what would be her front doorway, looking out over the creek valley with the vast Wyoming sky overhead, Elsie felt something settle in her chest, a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. "It's going to be beautiful," she said. "It's going to be yours," Zeke replied, and the way he said it made the words feel like a promise. That afternoon, they began the preliminary work, clearing the building site of brush and rocks, marking where the foundation stones would go. The labor was hard but satisfying, and Elsie found herself laughing more than she had in years as they worked together. Zeke proved to be excellent company, quick with a joke when the work got tedious, patient when she needed instruction, generous with praise when she mastered a new skill. By evening, her muscles ached pleasantly, and her hands were dirty, but she felt more alive than she had in months. As they sat by the creek sharing a simple supper, Zeke pulled out a small leather pouch and handed it to her. "What's this?" "Garden seeds. Thought you might want to plan where to put a vegetable patch." Elsie opened the pouch to find packets of seeds for beans, squash, lettuce, carrots, and even flower hollyhocks and sweet peas that would climb the walls and fill the air with fragrance. "You think of everything," she said softly. "I think of you," he replied, and the simple honesty of it made her breath catch. That night, as she lay in the line shack listening to the creek's eternal murmur, Elsie thought about the house that would rise on the hill above her. More than timber and nails, it would be a declaration of independence, proof that she belonged in this wild country, whether society approved or not. And the man who would build it with his own hands, what was he but another kind of home, a place where her heart could finally rest after so many years of wandering. For the first time since Mrs. Abernathy's visit, Elsie slept deeply and peacefully, dreaming of houses and gardens and the steady rhythm of hammer on nail. Construction on the house began in earnest the following week. Zeke arrived each morning before dawn, and together they fell into a rhythm of shared labor that felt as natural as breathing. He cut and shaped the timber while Elsie prepared the foundation stones, and by evening they would sit by the creek, planning the next day's work and sharing quiet conversation. It was during one of these peaceful moments that Elsie discovered the first hint that Zeke wasn't exactly who she'd believed him to be. They were examining the legal deed he'd brought for her to sign, a document that would make her the legal owner of the land where her house was being built. As she read through the formal language, her eye caught on something that made her pause. "Zeke," she said slowly, "this deed lists you as the grantor. It says you're transferring ownership from yourself to me." "That's right. But this land," she looked around at the creek valley, the rolling hills that stretched to the horizon. "This is more than just a building lot. According to this deed, you own 2,000 acres. Zeke's hands stilled on the piece of harness he'd been mending. "About that, yes." 2,000 acres, Elsie repeated, trying to comprehend the vastness of such a holding. "That's not the property of a simple cattle drover." "Never said I was simple." The evasion sparked something in Elsie's mind, small details she'd noticed but not questioned. The quality of his clothes, despite their worn appearance, the way other men in town deferred to him. The fact that he could afford to take an entire season off from work to build a house. "Who are you really?" she asked. Zeke sighed and set aside his mending. "My name is Ezekiel Boone, just like I told you. But there's more to the story than I've shared." He stood and walked to the edge of the creek, staring out at the water as if gathering courage. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old secrets. "My father wasn't just any settler who died of fever. He was Marcus Boone, one of the first men to drive cattle into this territory. Built up a spread that covered most of this valley before the sickness took him." Elsie felt the ground shift beneath her understanding. "You inherited all this?" "Every acre, along with debts that took me 10 years to pay off and a name that carries weight in these parts." He turned back to face her, and she saw vulnerability in his expression that explained years of careful evasion. "I've been living like a hired hand by choice, not necessity." "But why? Why hide your circumstances?" Zeke's laugh was bitter. You've met the local ladies' auxiliary. Imagine how they'd react to knowing I'm one of the wealthiest landowners in the territory. Suddenly, every widow and spinster for 100 miles would be interested in my prospects instead of my character. The truth hit Elsie like a physical blow. That's what you think this is? That I'm interested in your money? No, Zeke said quickly, seeing the hurt in her eyes. That's not what I think at all. But I needed to be sure you cared about the man, not the holdings. So you've been testing me. I've been protecting myself. And you, if you'll think about it, if word gets around that you're being courted by Ezekiel Boone, the landowner, instead of Zeke, the cattle drover, how long do you think it'll be before every gossip in Wyoming decides you're a fortune hunter who seduced a lonely man? Elsie sank onto the log where they'd shared so many evening conversations, her mind reeling. Everything she thought she knew about their relationship had just shifted. The generous gifts, the offer to build her a house, the proposal of marriage, all of it, took on different meaning when viewed through the lens of his actual circumstances. The legal deed in your pocket, she said, pieces falling into place. You're not just giving me a building lot. You're giving me prime grazing land worth a fortune. Land that's been empty too long. Land that needs someone to love it. And the house you're building, that's not a simple cabin. It's a ranch house, suitable for a landowner's wife. Zeke knelt beside the log where she sat, his expression earnest. It's a house for you, Elsie. Nothing more, nothing less. I don't care if you never see another acre of my property. That land is yours, free and clear, regardless of what happens between us. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Because I've learned that money changes everything, changes how people see you, how they treat you, what they want from you. His voice grew rough with emotion. When I saw you on that depot platform, alone and abandoned, I knew you were different. You saw something in me that had nothing to do with what I owned or how much my land was worth. You saw the man, not the holdings. Elsie stared at him, trying to reconcile the humble cattle drover she'd come to care for with this wealthy rancher who'd been hiding in plain sight. The deception stung, but she could also understand the reasons behind it. What about the other ranch hands? Surely they know who you really are. They work for me, but we keep the relationship informal. I pay fair wages and treat them as equals, and they respect my privacy. It's worked well enough for years. Until I came along. Until you came along and made me want something I'd given up hoping for. The weight of his confession settled between them. Elsie looked out at the land that was apparently hers, now rolling grassland that stretched to the distant mountains, more space than she'd ever imagined owning. I don't know how to be a landowner, she said finally. You don't have to be anything but yourself. The land comes with no obligations except to enjoy it. And if I decide not to marry you, if I choose to leave Wyoming after all, then the land is still yours. You can sell it, lease it, or let it sit empty. Your choice entirely. Zeke's voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. I meant what I said about building you a house, because you deserve one. Your wealth doesn't change that. Elsie stood and walked to the edge of her property, for it was truly hers now, she realized with a mix of wonder and terror. 2,000 acres of some of the most beautiful land in Wyoming territory, given to her by a man who'd hidden his true circumstances for fear of being wanted for the wrong reasons. I need time to think, she said. Of course. But Elsie, he caught her hand as she turned to go. Whatever you decide about the land, about marriage, about staying or leaving, please don't let my deception poison what we've built together. I may have hidden my circumstances, but everything else has been honest. My feelings for you, my respect for your character, my desire to see you happy and safe, all of that is real. Looking into his eyes, Elsie saw the truth of his words, alongside the fear that he'd lost her trust forever. The man who'd rescued her from despair was still there, beneath the revelation of his wealth, still kind, still generous, still lonely in ways that money couldn't fix. I need to understand what this means, she said. For me, for us, for everything I thought I knew about my future. That night, alone in the line shack that now sat on her own land, Elsie held the deed that made her one of the wealthiest women in the territory. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come to Wyoming seeking marriage to a modest rancher and had instead found herself the object of affection from one of the most eligible bachelors in the West. But more than the shock of his circumstances, she grappled with what his deception meant for their relationship. Could she trust a man who'd hidden such fundamental truths about himself? Or was his caution understandable given the world they lived in, where a woman's character was often judged by her husband's bank account? As dawn approached, Elsie realized that the questions keeping her awake weren't really about money or land or social standing. They were about whether two wounded people could build something real and lasting together, whether love could grow from friendship, even when that friendship had been built on careful omissions and protective lies. The answer, she suspected, would determine not just her future in Wyoming, but whether she was brave enough to risk her heart on a gentle giant who'd been afraid to show her who he really was. For 3 days, Elsie wrestled with the revelation of Zeke's true circumstances. She walked her new property boundaries, trying to absorb the reality of suddenly owning more land than some entire English counties. She examined every conversation they'd shared, looking for other deceptions hidden beneath his careful words. She stared at the half-built house rising on the hill and wondered if she was looking at a home or an elaborate attempt to buy her affections. Zeke continued to arrive each morning to work on the construction, but the easy camaraderie they'd shared was strained. He answered her questions about his holdings, honestly the cattle operation that employed 30 men, the mining interests that supplemented the ranch income, the investments in Denver and San Francisco that had multiplied his inherited wealth. "I should have told you sooner," he said on the 4th morning, as they worked together to raise the front wall of the house. "But I've learned to be careful with the truth about money. It changes everything." "It has changed everything," Elsie admitted, holding a beam steady while he positioned it. "I thought I was falling in love with a kind cattle drover who was generous beyond his means. Now I discover I'm falling in love with one of the wealthiest men in Wyoming territory who can afford any generosity he chooses." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and they both froze. She'd admitted her feelings aloud, something she'd been too cautious to do, even in her own thoughts. "Are you," Zeke asked quietly, "falling in love with me?" Elsie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "I was. I am. But I don't know which version of you is real, the humble man who offered shelter to a stranger, or the wealthy landowner who can afford to play at kindness. They're the same man, Elsie. The money doesn't change my character. Doesn't it? You've been lying to me for weeks. I've been protecting us both, and it wasn't lying. It was simply not sharing everything at once." They worked in tense silence for the rest of the morning, but the conversation had opened something between them that couldn't be closed again. The admission of love hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Elsie was washing dishes when she heard a horse approaching and looked out to see a well-dressed stranger riding up to the line shack. He was a man of middle years with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. "Miss Parker," he called, dismounting with practiced ease. "I'm Judge Morrison from the Territorial Court. Might I have a word with you?" Elsie's heart sank. Mrs. Abernathy had made good on her threat about legal consequences. She dried her hands and stepped outside, trying to maintain her composure. "Certainly, Your Honor. How may I help you?" "I understand you've been granted a significant parcel of land by Mr. Ezekiel Boone. I wanted to ensure the transfer was conducted properly and that you understand the implications of such a gift." "I have the deed," Elsie said carefully. "It seems to be in order." "Oh, the paperwork is perfect. Zeke's always been meticulous about legal matters, but I wanted to make certain you weren't being taken advantage of. 2,000 acres of prime grazing land is worth a considerable fortune." The judge's tone was kind but probing, and Elsie realized this wasn't about legal impropriety, was about protecting Zeke's interests from a potential fortune hunter. "I assure you, Your Honor, I asked for no such gift. Mr. Boone insisted on the land transfer despite my protests." "I'm sure he did. Zeke's got the most generous heart in the territory, which is why his friends worry about him. Judge Morrison's eyes were shrewd but not unkind. He's been alone too long, and sometimes lonely men make decisions with their hearts instead of their heads. Before Elsie could respond, they heard the sound of another horse approaching. Zeke appeared around the bend, and his expression darkened when he saw the judge talking to Elsie. "Judge Morrison," he said, dismounting with controlled movements, "what brings you out this way?" "Checking on the welfare of the territory's most eligible bachelor," the judge replied with a wry smile. "Heard you'd given away half your holdings to a lady you've known for a few weeks." "My property to dispose of as I see fit," Zeke said, his voice carrying an edge Elsie had never heard before. "Of course, but your friends are concerned about your judgment in this matter." "My judgment is sound. Miss Parker has done nothing to encourage this gift beyond accepting shelter when she needed it." "I'm sure that's true, but you have to understand how it looks a wealthy man transferring valuable property to a woman who arrived as another man's intended bride. People will talk." "Let them talk," Zeke said flatly. Judge Morrison studied both of them carefully. "There's one way to settle all concerns about impropriety and Miss Parker's motives. Marriage would make the land transfer a simple matter between husband and wife." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Elsie felt trapped between their expectations and her own conflicted feelings. "Marriage should be about more than settling property concerns," she said quietly. "Of course," the judge agreed, "but it would solve several problems at once. Miss Parker would have an unassailable position in society. Zeke would have a helpmate worthy of his station, and the gossips would have nothing left to whisper about." "And if we don't marry?" Elsie asked. "Then I'm afraid the territorial government might need to investigate whether proper procedures were followed in the land transfer. Gifts of such magnitude between unmarried persons can raise questions about irregular relationships." The veiled threat was clear: marry Zeke or face the possibility of losing the land and being branded as something shameful. After the judge left, Elsie and Zeke stood in the shadow of the half-built house, both lost in their own thoughts. The walls rose around them like the framework of a decision that had to be made. "He's right about one thing," Zeke said finally. "Marriage would solve the immediate problems." "Is that what you want? A marriage of convenience to satisfy the neighbors?" "You know it's more than that. I told you weeks ago that I'd consider myself the luckiest man in Wyoming to have you as my wife. Nothing's changed, except that now you know I can provide for you properly." "Everything's changed. When I thought you were a simple cattle drover, marriage felt like a partnership between equals. Now you know I have money, and suddenly you think we're not equals anymore." Zeke's voice was frustrated. "The money doesn't make me a different person, Elsie. But it makes me a different person in the eyes of the world. If I marry you now, I'll always be seen as the fortune hunter who seduced a wealthy rancher. My own motivations will always be suspect. Only to people whose opinions don't matter. They matter to me. I've spent my whole life building a reputation based on honesty and hard work. I won't have that destroyed by whispers about what I did to secure my future." They worked on the house in tense silence that afternoon, but Elsie could feel Zeke's eyes on her as she moved through the motions of construction. The walls were nearly complete now, and she could envision the finished structure, a beautiful home that would be forever tainted by the circumstances of its creation. As evening approached, Zeke set down his hammer and turned to face her with an expression of quiet determination. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his vest pocket. "Something I've been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment." He pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by handling. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's," he said softly. "My father gave it to her when they were married, and she wore it every day until she died. It's not the fanciest ring in the territory, but it's honest and true, like the love it represents." Elsie stared at the ring, her throat tight with emotion. In the fading light, the diamond caught fire like a captured star. "Zeke, marry me, Elsie. Not because of the land or the money or what people will say, but because we belong together, because we're better together than we are apart, because love like ours doesn't come along often, and it's worth fighting for. The proposal hung between them like a bridge across uncertain waters. On one side lay the safety of the life she'd known, solitary, careful, free from the complications of love and trust. On the other lay a future she'd never dared imagine: partnership, prosperity, and a love that had grown from friendship into something deeper than passion. "The house will be finished in 2 weeks," Zeke continued. "We could be married then, here on the land that's yours, in the home we've built together. Or you can take the deed and go wherever your heart leads you. But don't let fear of what others might think rob us of something beautiful." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Elsie looked at the man who'd rescued her from despair and offered her not just shelter, but a home. Not just security, but love. Not just a marriage of convenience, but a partnership that could weather any storm. The ring glowed in the dying light, waiting for her answer. And for the first time since learning the truth about Zeke's circumstances, Elsie felt the fog of confusion begin to clear, revealing the simple truth that had been there all along. Sometimes the greatest risk was not taking one at all. The house stood complete at last, its new timber golden in the late afternoon sun. 2 weeks had passed since Zeke's proposal, 2 weeks of careful work and careful conversation as they finished what they'd started together. Now, standing before the hand-carved door that would serve as the threshold to her new life, Elsie felt the weight of decision pressing down upon her. Zeke had worked tirelessly to complete every detail: the windows perfectly fitted, the floors sanded smooth, the stone fireplace drawing cleanly. Even the small sewing room was finished, with built-in shelves for her supplies and 2 large windows positioned to catch the morning light. "It's beautiful," Elsie said, running her hand along the doorframe. Every surface showed the marks of careful craftsmanship, the attention of a man who built things to last. "It's yours," Zeke replied simply, "regardless of what you decide about the rest." They danced around the subject of marriage for days, both afraid to push for a final answer. The ring remained in its small wooden box, carried in Zeke's vest pocket, like a talisman of hope. "Show me the inside," Elsie said. Zeke opened the door-solid oak he'd shaped and fitted himself, and gestured for her to enter first. The main room was spacious but intimate, with the stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows that framed views of the creek valley. The kitchen area featured a dry sink and shelves for dishes, while the bedroom beyond offered privacy and comfort. But it was the sewing room that made Elsie's breath catch. Not only had Zeke built the shelves and positioned the windows perfectly, but he'd also installed a work table at precisely the right height for her frame. Small cubbyholes held spools of thread, and a special compartment protected her precious needles. "You remembered everything," she whispered. "I remember everything about you, Elsie. The way you hold your needle, the angle of your shoulders when you work, the light you prefer for close stitching. I built this room for you, for the woman who transforms torn cloth into something beautiful again." Tears pricked her eyes at the thoughtfulness of it. This wasn't just a house, it was a home designed around her needs, her work, her dreams. It was a declaration of love, written in timber and stone. "There's something else," Zeke said, producing a key from his pocket. "The deed may be in your name, but this key belongs to you alone. Whatever you decide about marriage, this house is your sanctuary. No one can take it from you." Elsie took the key, feeling its weight in her palm. Such a small thing to represent such enormous change, from homeless stranger to property owner, from discarded mail-order bride to cherished woman. "I need to tell you something," she said, settling into one of the chairs Zeke had built for the main room, "about why I've been so hesitant to give you an answer." Zeke sat across from her, his large frame somehow managing to look both powerful and vulnerable. "I'm listening. It's not about the money, not really. It's about what the money represents: choices I've never had, security I've never known, a life I never dared imagine." She twisted the key between her fingers. "I've been poor, Zeke, not genteel poverty, but real hunger, real desperation. When I lost my shop in London, I came within days of ending up on the streets. I know, he said gently. I could see it in your eyes that first day, the fear of someone who's known what it means to have nothing. Then you understand why your wealth frightens me, not because I don't trust you, but because I don't trust myself. How can I be sure my feelings are real when you're offering everything I've ever wanted? How can I know the difference between love and gratitude? Zeke leaned forward, his pale eyes earnest. The same way I know the difference between love and loneliness, by listening to your heart instead of your fears. What if my heart is wrong? What if I'm just a desperate woman clinging to the first man who showed her kindness? Then what am I? A lonely man so starved for companionship that I'd build a house for any woman who'd accept my attention. Zeke shook his head. We both know that's not true. What we have is real, Elsie. It started before you knew about my circumstances, before I knew you'd stay in Wyoming. It grew from shared conversations and mutual respect and the simple pleasure of each other's company. But how can we be sure? We can't. That's what makes it love instead of logic. Zeke pulled the ring box from his pocket and set it on the table between them. Love is always a risk. The question is whether the risk is worth taking. Elsie stared at the box, knowing that her answer would change everything. If she said yes, she'd be committing to a life beyond her wildest dreams. If she said no, she'd be giving up the chance at happiness she'd never expected to find. I want to show you something, she said suddenly, rising from her chair. Wait here. She hurried to the line shack and returned carrying his mother's quilt, the one she'd been mending these past weeks. Spreading it carefully on the table, she showed him her work, every torn seam repaired, every faded patch reinforced, the entire coverlet restored to its original beauty. When you gave me this quilt, it was damaged, she said, smoothing the fabric with gentle hands. Not beyond repair, but broken in places that mattered. I could have patched it quickly, made it functional again. Instead, I chose to restore it properly, the way your mother would have wanted, the way it deserved. Zeke touched the quilt reverently, seeing his mother's handiwork brought back to life. It's perfect, better than perfect. That's what love does, Elsie said softly. It doesn't just patch the broken places, it restores them, makes them stronger than before. She looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. You've done that for me, Zeke. Taken a woman who was broken and discarded and made her whole again. Not by covering the damaged parts, but by showing me they were worth repairing. Elsie, I love you, she said, the words rushing out before courage could desert her. Not your money, not your land, not what you can provide. I love the man who builds perfect nails for a stranger's house. The man who remembers how I like my light for sewing. The man who offers shelter without expecting anything in return. Zeke's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to shed. Does that mean? Yes, Elsie whispered, reaching for the ring box with trembling fingers. Yes, I'll marry you. Not because it's practical or proper or solves our problems, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. The ring slipped onto her finger as if it had been made for her, the diamond catching the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows of their new home. As Zeke's arms closed around her, Elsie felt the final pieces of her new life fall into place. The desperate scrambling of a woman with no choices, but the joyful acceptance of a woman who had found her heart's home at last. The kiss that followed was nothing like the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper and more enduring, a promise sealed with tenderness and the certainty of two hearts that had found their home in each other. When they finally broke apart, Zeke rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. I was so afraid I'd lost you when you learned about the money. You almost did, Elsie admitted. Not because of what you owned, but because I thought you'd been playing a role. I needed to know that the man I fell in love with was real. He's real. He's standing right here, scared to death that he's dreaming and you'll disappear when he wakes up. Elsie laughed, the sound bright and free in the golden light of their new home. I'm real too, and I'm not going anywhere. They sat together on the front step of the house as the sun painted the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and purples. From their vantage point on the hill, They could see for miles across the rolling grassland that was now theirs to share. "When shall we marry?" Zeke asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "As soon as possible," Elsie said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I've waited 56 years to find the right man. I don't want to waste another day." "Tomorrow, then. Judge Morrison owes me a favor, can perform the ceremony here, in our home." "What about guests? Shouldn't we invite people?" Zeke's smile was wry. "Who would we invite? Mrs. Abernathy and her moral crusaders, the ranch hands who've been watching this unfold like a stage play, or perhaps Harold Jameson, who started this whole adventure by being too particular about his bride's specifications." Elsie giggled at the absurdity of it. "Just us, then, and the judge. And perhaps Mrs. Henderson from the general store. She's been kind to me." "Mrs. Henderson it is. She can serve as witness and spread the news that we've done the proper thing." They made their plans as the stars appeared overhead, their voices soft in the evening stillness. Tomorrow they would marry. Tonight they would spend their last evening as single people in the little line shack where their love had grown from friendship. "I have something else for you," Zeke said, as they prepared to walk back down to the creek. "A wedding gift." He produced a simple tin cup from his saddlebag, dented and worn from years of use around campfires and cattle drives. "It's not much to look at," he said, suddenly shy, "but it's Minea's been for 20 years. Thought maybe we could share our first cup of coffee as husband and wife from it tomorrow morning." Elsie took the cup, running her fingers over its battered surface. It was utterly practical, completely unglamorous, and perfect in its honesty, like the man who offered it. "I love it," she said, meaning every word. "It's you, honest and real and built to last." That night, lying alone in the line shack for what would be the last time, Elsie listened to the familiar sounds of Antelope Creek and marveled at how completely her life had changed. 3 months ago, she'd been a failed seamstress with no prospects and no hope. Tomorrow, she would wake as the wife of one of Wyoming Territory's most respected ranchers, mistress of a beautiful home and thousands of acres of prime land. But more than the material transformation, she thought about the emotional journey that had brought her here. She'd learned to trust again after years of disappointment. She'd found the courage to risk her heart despite the fear of being hurt. She'd discovered that love didn't always come wrapped in the package you expected. Sometimes it arrived disguised as a gentle giant who noticed your dignity in moments of despair. The ring on her finger caught starlight through the small window, and Elsie smiled as she drifted towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring a new name, a new home, and a new chapter in a story she'd thought was nearly finished. Instead, she was discovering it had only just begun. Morning came crisp and clear, with frost silvering the grass and the promise of a perfect autumn day. Elsie woke to the sound of hammering and looked out to see Zeke building something near the front door of their house. "What are you making?" she called, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as she walked up the hill. "Wedding arch," he said, standing back to admire his handiwork. "Figured if we're going to do this, we might as well do it right." The arch was simple but elegant, constructed from fresh-cut pine boughs and positioned to frame the view of the creek valley. Wild asters and late-blooming prairie roses were woven through the greenery, creating a bower fit for a frontier wedding. "It's beautiful," Elsie breathed. "Not as beautiful as you're going to be standing under it," Zeke said, his eyes soft with love. Judge Morrison arrived at noon, accompanied by Mrs. Henderson and her husband, who served as additional witnesses. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, with vows spoken in the shadow of the wedding arch while the Wyoming wind whispered through the pines. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Zeke's kiss was gentle and reverent, as if he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. The small gathering cheered, and Mrs. Henderson wiped tears from her eyes as she congratulated the newlyweds. After their guests departed, Ezekiel and Elsie Boone sat on their front step, sharing coffee from the battered tin cup, watching the sun set over land that was truly theirs. The shared cup passed between them like a communion, sealing their partnership in the most elemental way. "No regrets?" Zeke asked as twilight painted the sky purple. "Only that we waited so long to find each other," Elsie replied, leaning against his solid shoulder. As the first stars appeared, they rose and walked hand in hand through the door of their new homino, longer two lonely people offering each other comfort, but partners bound by love and commitment, ready to face whatever the future might hold together. 6 months later, Elsie Boone stood in the garden behind their house, watching the first green shoots of spring push through the rich Wyoming soil. The vegetable seeds Zeke had given her were finally sprouting beans and squash, carrots and lettuce, all responding to the warming earth with the promise of summer abundance. The hollyhocks she'd planted along the south wall of the house were already showing sturdy growth, and by July they would climb toward the eaves, filling the air with sweet fragrance. The sweet peas were twining around the posts of the front porch, reaching for the light with delicate tendrils that reminded Elsie of her own gradual adaptation to this vast, beautiful country. Winter had been long, but not lonely. She and Zeke had spent the cold months learning the rhythms of marriage, discovering how two independent souls could weave their lives together without losing what made each of them unique. They'd read by the fire on snowy evenings, worked on household projects that required 4 hands, and talked through the details of building a life together. Elsie had established a thriving alteration business, serving the wives and daughters of ranchers throughout the territory. Word of her skill had spread quickly, and she now had more work than she could handle. The sewing room Zeke had designed proved perfect for her needs, and she often found herself humming while she worked, content in a way she'd never imagined possible. The gossips had eventually found other scandals to occupy their attention. Mrs. Abernathy had made one attempt to visit the newlyweds, ostensibly to welcome Elsie to proper society, but had found herself facing a confident woman who needed no one's approval to validate her place in the world. "Mrs. Boone," she'd said stiffly, clearly struggling with the reality that her moral concerns had been rendered irrelevant by marriage. "Mrs. Abernathy," Elsie had replied with serene politeness. "How kind of you to call. I'm afraid I'm quite busy with orders, but please give my regards to the ladies' auxiliary." The visit had been brief, and there had been no others. Elsie suspected that Mrs. Abernathy found the sight of obvious happiness more disturbing than any impropriety she'd imagined. Now, as she knelt among the emerging vegetables, Elsie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who'd stepped off the train in Cheyenne, bearing nothing but a carpetbag and a letter of false promise, seemed like a stranger now, someone she'd known long ago, but whose fears and desperation she could barely remember. "Admiring our farm," Zeke's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and pride. "Our farm," Elsie repeated, savoring the sound of those words. "I still can't quite believe it's real sometimes." Zeke knelt beside her in the soft earth, his large hands gentle as he examined the tender plants. "Looks like everything's taking root nicely. Should have plenty of vegetables for canning come harvest time. And flowers for the house. I've always wanted a garden where I could grow things just for their beauty." "Then you shall have all the beauty you can plant," Zeke said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Speaking of which, I have something to show you." He led her to the far corner of the garden, where he'd been working mysteriously for the past week. There, surrounded by a small white fence, was a collection of rose bushes, some already showing buds, others still establishing their roots. "I ordered them from Denver," he explained, suddenly shy. "Different varieties that should bloom from spring through fall. Thought you might like cut flowers for the house." Elsie felt tears prick her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. Not grand or expensive, but perfectly suited to her tastes and needs. Like everything else about their marriage, it was based on paying attention to what truly mattered. "They're perfect," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Everything about this life is perfect. Even the hard parts, the isolation, the harsh winters, the work that never seems to end. Especially those parts," Elsie said firmly, "because they're ours to face together." They walked back toward the house as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the land that stretched to the horizon. The house stood solid and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney where their breakfast fire still burned. It looked, Elsie thought, exactly like what it was, a home built by love and maintained by partnership. On the front porch, the rocking chair Zeke had built during the winter months sat ready for the evening ritual they'd established. Coffee shared while watching the sunset paint the western sky. The battered tin cup that had served as their wedding chalice held a place of honor on the kitchen shelf, used every morning for their first shared coffee of the day. Inside, the house bore the marks of their combined lives. Elsie's sewing occupied one corner of the main room, while Zeke's account books and ranch papers claimed another. The kitchen showed evidence of shared cooking, and the bedroom reflected the easy intimacy of two people who'd learned to sleep peacefully in each other's arms. But it was the small touches that spoke most eloquently of their happiness: wildflowers in mason jars, books shared and discussed, the comfortable way their possessions had mingled without conflict. This was what a real home looked like, Elsie realized. Not perfect or fancy, but lived in and loved. As they prepared lunch together, Zeke slicing bread while Elsie arranged cold meat and cheese, she found herself thinking about the other path her life might have taken. If Harold Jameson had found her suitable, she would have become a rancher's wife in a very different way, valued for her utility rather than cherished for herself, grateful for security rather than joyful in partnership. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" she asked. "If Harold Jameson had decided I was sturdy enough for his needs?" Zeke paused in his bread slicing, considering the question seriously. "I think I would have spent the rest of my life looking for you without knowing what I was searching for. And you would have been safe but not happy, provided for but not loved the way you deserve. So you think it all worked out as it was meant to?" "I think we were both ready to recognize something precious when we found it. Maybe that's what makes the difference: no chance, but readiness." They ate their lunch on the front porch, watching clouds build over the distant mountains. The conversation was comfortable and meandering, touching on plans for expanding the vegetable garden, the need to repair the barn roof before the next winter, and the letter Elsie had received from a cousin in England who was amazed by her descriptions of life in Wyoming territory. "She can't understand why I'd choose this over London society," Elsie said, smoothing the pages of the letter. "She thinks I've lost my mind, marrying a man I'd known for such a short time and moving to what she calls the wilderness." "What did you tell her?" "That I've finally found the place where I belong. That sometimes the wilderness is exactly where you need to be to discover who you really are." Zeke's smile was warm with understanding. "And who are you really, Elsie Boone?" "A woman who was brave enough to risk everything for love. A woman who learned that home isn't a place you're born to, but a place you choose to build." She looked out over their land, their garden, their life. "A woman who discovered that sometimes the best things come disguised as endings." As the afternoon wore on toward evening, they worked together in companionable silence, Zeke mending harness leather while Elsie hemmed a dress for a customer's daughter. The rhythm of shared labor was as natural as breathing now, each absorbed in their own tasks, but aware of the other's presence in the way that speaks of deep contentment. When the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they set aside their work and settled into the rocking chairs that had become their evening sanctuary. The coffee in the tin cup was strong and hot, passing between them like a ritual of connection. "Any regrets?" Zeke asked, as he had on their wedding night. "Only that it took me 56 years to find you," Elsie replied, "as she had then and would again tomorrow, and all the tomorrows that followed." As the stars emerged in the vast Wyoming sky, Elsie reflected on the journey that had brought her from a failed seamstress sleeping on depot benches to a cherished wife watching sunset from her own front porch. It had been a path she never could have imagined, filled with risks she'd never thought herself brave enough to take. But love, she'd learned, had a way of making you braver than you knew you could be. It took the broken pieces of your life and wove them into something stronger, more beautiful than anything you could have created alone. In the growing darkness, their house glowed with warmth and welcome, a beacon of home in the vastness of the frontier. And in her husband's gentle presence beside her, Elsie found the deepest truth of her new life. That love measured by kindness could indeed take root on the hardest ground. growing into something that would endure long after the first desperate hope had transformed into lasting joy. The mail-order bride who'd been deemed too small had found her perfect fit at last, not in size or circumstance, but in the infinite space of a heart large enough to hold all the love she'd never dared to dream possible.